The wagon lurched to a stop so violently that Eliza Rowan's head struck the wooden frame stars, exploding behind her eyes. Like the first flakes of the blizzard that had been chasing them across the Dakota Territory for the past 3 hours. Through the frost-etched window, she watched Samuel Bright's shoulders rigid as fence posts as he sat motionless on the driver's seat, his breath forming angry plumes in the December air that seemed to match the fury radiating from every line of his body. "Something's wrong," her mind whispered the same voice that had warned her about Margaret's too bright smiles, about the way men's eyes followed her down the streets of Bangor after the scandal broke. But this was different. This was the moment when salvation revealed itself as another form of damnation. Samuel. The word escaped her lips like a prayer to a God who'd stopped listening months ago when her life had first crumbled beneath the weight of her sister's jealousy. What's happened? When he turned, the face that looked back at her belonged to a stranger. Gone was the stern but righteous man who'd written careful letters about Christian partnership and frontier responsibility. This was something carved from prairie wind, and bitter cold a mask of rage twisted by humiliation, and something darker still. In his pale eyes, she saw not her future husband, but her executioner. "This is how I die," she thought with crystalline clarity, and the realization brought not panic, but a strange, calm recognition. She'd been running toward this moment since the day she'd fled Maine, carrying nothing but a carpet bag and the weight of accusations that would follow her to whatever grave the frontier provided. "Get out." His voice cut through the howling wind like a blade through silk. The words carried the finality of a judge's sentence. And suddenly, Eliza was 8 years old again, hiding in the root cellar while her father screamed at her mother about debts and drink and the children who were bleeding them dry. That same helpless terror clawed at her chest now, but underneath it burned something new, a fury that tasted of iron and winter air. "Samuel, please, don't." He was already climbing down from the wagon, his movements sharp with barely controlled violence. "Don't say another word. I've heard enough lies from lying lips to last 3 lifetimes." Snow swirled around them like ghosts as he wrenched open the wagon door, and the full force of the blizzard hit Eliza like a physical blow. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the last hour, and the wind carried ice crystals that stung her exposed skin like angry wasps. I don't understand," she said, though, even as the words left her mouth, she caught sight of the crumpled letter in his fist and understood everything with sickening clarity. The paper bore the distinctive violet ink Margaret had always favored, and Eliza could see familiar handwriting twisted into unfamiliar shapes. Even here she thought with bitter admiration for her sister's reach. 1,000 miles from home, and still her poison finds its mark. "You lied about everything." Samuel continued, his voice cracking like winter ice. "Your virtue, your education, your very character. I paid good money for a Christian wife, not some Eastern harlot dressed up in innocent clothing." He seized her arms and dragged her from the wagon's meager warmth, her feet hitting the frozen ground with a shock that shot up through her bones. The snow was already knee-deep and rising fast, each flake a tiny executioner carrying out winter's sentence on anyone foolish enough to be caught unprepared. "Please," she began. But Samuel was already hurling her carpetbag into a drift, where it disappeared with a muffled thud. "Whatever you've been told, I've been told enough." He climbed back onto the wagon seat, gathering the reins with hands that shook with more than cold. "Maybe the wolves will teach you the price of deception better than any Christian man could." The last word hit her like a physical blow. Wolves. She'd heard the stories around frontier hearths, families found in spring, reduced to scattered bones, children who wandered too far from settlements and simply vanished into the vastness that stretched beyond every horizon. But as the wagon rolled away into the white void, taking with it her last connection to civilization and warmth, Eliza felt something unexpected bloom in her chest. Not despair, but rage. Pure, clean anger that burned hotter than any fire. I will not die whimpering in the snow, she decided, and the thought carried the iron certainty of her grandmother's voice, the Irish woman who'd survived famine and crossing and built a new life in America with nothing but stubborn will. The Rowan women don't break easy. The blizzard screamed around her like all the furies of hell unleashed. But Eliza Rowan wrapped her thin cloak tighter and began to walk into the storm's teeth each step, a defiant declaration that winter would have to work harder to claim her soul. Behind her, the wagon tracks were already disappearing beneath fresh snow, and ahead lay nothing but endless white and the promise of wolves. But she was alive, and while life remained, choice remained. The storm had stolen her shelter, her supplies, her future. But it could not steal her will to survive. She would live to see Samuel Bright answer for this night's work, or she would die trying. The cold was a living predator that stalked her through the blizzard, patient and relentless as death itself. Within the first mile, Eliza's feet had gone from burning to numb her thin boots, no match for snow that reached past her knees. The wind drove ice crystals into her face, like buckshot, each gust threatening to knock her from her feet and leave her buried beneath the accumulating drifts. But her mind, sharpened by years of teaching unruly children and managing household crises, began to catalog survival strategies with methodical precision. The depression to her left might indicate a creek bed potential shelter, but also the risk of breaking through ice into freezing water. The darker shapes ahead could be trees or rock formations offering windbreak if she could reach them. Most importantly, she had to keep moving. Standing still meant death, and she'd come too far to die now in this howling wilderness. Think Eliza. What would father have done? Her father had been a practical man beneath the drink and the rage, a logger who'd understood that the forest was both provider and predator, depending on how you approached it. Respect the wild, he'd told her once, but don't fear it. Fear makes you stupid, and stupid kills you faster than cold or wolves or anything else the woods can throw at you. The memory brought unexpected strength, and Eliza forced herself to study her surroundings with professional detachment. The wind was coming consistently from the northwest, which meant she could use it as a crude compass. The snow fell harder in some areas than others, suggesting variations in terrain that might offer better shelter. After what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, she spotted what she'd been hoping for, a dark line against the white that resolved into a low ridge topped with scraggly pines. The trees weren't much, but they broke the wind's force and created a small pocket of relative calm. She hollowed out a depression in the snow beneath the largest pine using her hands until her fingers went numb, then her elbows and knees. The work warmed her temporarily, but she could feel hypothermia beginning its insidious advance. The confusion, the drowsiness, the treacherous desire to simply lie down and rest. No, she told herself firmly, not like this. Not because Samuel Bright is too much of a coward to face his own failures. That was when she heard the first howl, low and mournful, carried on the wind from somewhere in the white void around her. Then another closer this time. And another. Wolves. The word sent ice through her veins that had nothing to do with the temperature. She'd never seen a wolf, but every frontier story spoke of their intelligence, their pack hunting tactics, their ability to bring down prey much larger than themselves. A lone woman already weakened by cold and exhaustion would be easy meat for creatures who'd learned to survive in this harsh landscape. But when the first wolf appeared, a massive gray shadow materializing from the storm, like something born from winter itself, Eliza found herself strangely unafraid. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was the simple recognition that she'd reached the end of running. Either way, when the great beast padded closer and fixed her with intelligent yellow eyes, she spoke to it in the same gentle tone she'd once used with frightened children. "I know you're hungry," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I know winter is hard for everyone, but I'm not ready to die yet." The wolf tilted its massive head as if considering her words. Behind it, other shapes moved in the swirling snow, the pack waiting with supernatural patience for their leader's decision. Time stretched like a held-breath predator, and prey locked in a moment that could end only one way. Then, impossibly, the great wolf lay down in the snow beside her makeshift shelter. The others followed suit, forming a loose circle around her hiding place. Within minutes, their combined body heat created a pocket of warmth that meant the difference between death and another few hours of life. Eliza pressed herself against the pack leader's side, feeling his steady heartbeat through thick fur. And for the first time since the wagon had stopped, she allowed herself to hope. If I survive this, she promised the storm and the wolves, and whatever gods might be listening, Samuel Bright will answer for what he's done. Dawn brought a lessening of the wind, and the sound of hoofbeats cutting through the morning stillness. The wolves melted away like shadows at the approach of civilization, all except their leader, who remained pressed against Eliza's side as a rider emerged from the gray light. The man was Comanche, she could tell from his weathered face, his long black hair braided with strips of leather, the mixture of native and white clothing that marked those who moved between worlds. He rode a sturdy pinto horse and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged to this harsh landscape in ways she never would. When he saw her, a white woman half frozen and curled against a wolf in the middle of nowhere, his dark eyes registered surprise, calculation, and something that might have been recognition. "Well," he said, his English accented but precise, "that's either the bravest thing I've seen this winter or the most foolish. Probably both. Are you going to help me?" Eliza asked, her voice cracked and raw from breathing frozen air. The man studied her for a long moment, his gaze taking in her torn dress, her frostbitten hands, the wolf still pressed protectively against her side. "That depends," he said finally. "What's your story, and why should I care whether you live or die?" It was a fair question, brutally honest in the way of frontier people who couldn't afford the luxury of false sentiment. As Eliza told him about Samuel's abandonment, she watched his expression darken with something that went beyond simple anger. "Samuel Bright," he repeated when she finished. "The merchant from Ash Hollow. You know him. I know his type." The man dismounted and began unpacking supplies from his saddle. "Name's Mato Blackbird, and you just became the most interesting thing to happen to me in 3 years of exile." The line shack Mato brought her to was a rough shelter built to house cowboys during winter roundups. But after her night in the storm, it felt like a palace. He built up the fire and began the careful process of treating her frostbite, his movements economical and sure. "You'll keep the toes," he said, examining her feet. "But it was close. Another hour and you'd have been leaving pieces of yourself scattered across the territory." As warmth returned to her extremities with agonizing slowness, Mato told his own story. He'd been a war leader among the Comanche until a peace mission went catastrophically wrong, ending in massacre and mutual accusations of betrayal. The blame had fallen on him, and he'd been exiled from his people, marked as a traitor, and left to survive alone in the wilderness. "The truth," he said, checking her bandages, "is that my younger brother sold out the peace talks. Gambling debts to white traders who threatened his pregnant wife if he didn't pay with information about our negotiation site. But sometimes protecting family means accepting blame that isn't yours." Eliza understood. She'd spent years protecting Margaret from the consequences of her jealousy and spite, making excuses for behavior that grew progressively worse. Family was supposed to be sacred, but sometimes family was the source of your deepest wounds. "Samuel's been telling people I'm a thief and a whore," she said quietly. "By now, half the territory probably thinks I'm either dead or worse. And the other half thinks I'm a murderer and a traitor." Mato replied. "We make quite a pair." For 5 days they lived in peaceful isolation while Eliza's strength returned and her injuries healed. Mato taught her frontier survival skills, how to read weather signs, how to preserve meat, how to move quietly through forest and prairie. In return, she taught him to read and write skills that would serve him well in dealing with the white world that surrounded them. They didn't speak of attraction or affection. Such luxuries were dangerous for people in their position. But there was a growing understanding between them, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared experience of betrayal. It was on the 6th morning that their sanctuary was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Through the window, Eliza counted at least 15 riders, all armed, all moving with the grim purpose of men who'd convinced themselves they were doing righteous work. "Trouble," Mato said grimly, checking his rifle. "Samuel's been talking and people have been listening." At the head of the group rode Samuel himself, his face a mask of religious fury. Beside him was a man Eliza didn't recognize, tall, lean, with silver hair and the kind of pale eyes that missed nothing. What caught her attention was the way Mato stiffened when he saw the second rider. "Hayes," Mato said quietly. "Ranch foreman from the Broken Creek outfit. He's respected in these parts." "Friend or enemy?" "Neither. He's practical, which might be worse." The riders spread out around the cabin with military precision, their horses snorting clouds of vapor in the cold air. Samuel's voice cut through the morning stillness like a blade. "Come out, both of you. Face the justice you've earned." Mato moved to the door, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed. "What's the charge, Samuel?" "On theft, corruption, and conspiracy." Samuel's voice cracked with emotion. "That woman seduced me with lies, stole my property, and fled to her savage protector. I demand satisfaction. Satisfaction." Eliza stepped into view, ignoring Mato's warning gesture. "You want satisfaction? Then let's discuss what you did to an innocent woman in the middle of a blizzard." The accusation hit Samuel like a physical blow, but he recovered quickly. "Innocent? You call yourself innocent?" He pulled out a crumpled letter, one of her original correspondences, but altered with Margaret's distinctive forgery. "Your own words condemn you." Hayes spurred his horse forward to study the letter with professional interest. "This paper's been doctored," he announced after a careful examination. Words added, sentences changed. Someone wanted this woman to look guilty. "You'd take her word over mine." Samuel demanded, his desperation beginning to show. "A respected merchant against a fallen woman and her savage protector? I'd take the word of evidence," Hayes replied coolly. "And the evidence says someone's been playing games with the truth." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, and Eliza could feel the mood of the crowd beginning to shift. These were hard men who'd seen their share of frontier justice, but they had their own code of honor. A man who would abandon a woman to die in a blizzard was lower than the lowest criminal. It was then that a new voice cut through the tension, young, uncertain, but carrying the authority of official position. "Nobody's going anywhere until we sort this out proper." The speaker was a boy, really no more than 20, wearing a deputy's badge that looked too big for his narrow chest. But his rifle was steady, and his eyes held the kind of determination that came from trying to prove himself worthy of the authority he'd been given. "Deputy Morrison," Hayes said with a nod of acknowledgement. "Didn't expect to see you out this way." "Got word of trouble brewing," Morrison replied. "Sheriff's orders are to bring all parties back to town for a proper hearing. Nobody gets lynched on my watch." Samuel's face flushed with rage. "This is frontier justice. We don't need some Eastern court system to tell us what we can see with our own eyes." "What I see," Morrison said steadily, "is a lot of accusations flying around without much proof to back them up. So here's how this works. Everyone rides back to Ash Hollow, and we sort this out with witnesses and evidence and all the legal niceties that separate us from the animals." The young deputy's intervention should have diffused the situation. But Samuel was beyond reason, now driven by shame and fury, to a point where consequences no longer mattered. His hand dropped to his pistol, and the crowd tensed like a spring coiled too tight. "I won't be made a fool of," he snarled. Not by a lying whore and her savage lover, and not by some boy playing at being a lawman. The gun cleared leather with deadly speed, but Samuel's target wasn't Eliza or Mato. It was Deputy Morrison, the symbol of civilization that stood between him and the brutal justice he craved. Hayes's rifle spoke first, and the shot echoing across the prairie like thunder. Samuel spun from his saddle, his own weapon discharging harmlessly into the air as he hit the frozen ground and lay still. The silence that followed was profound. The would-be lynch mob looked at their dead leader, then at each other, suddenly uncertain about the righteousness of their cause. Without Samuel's driving fury to hold them together, they began to disperse, riding back to their homes with the weight of near atrocity heavy on their shoulders. "Well," Hayes said, dismounting to check Samuel's body, "that's one problem solved. But I suspect you folks have bigger troubles coming." He was right. Word of the confrontation would spread, growing more distorted with each telling. By the time it reached the territorial capital, the story would paint Samuel as a martyr and Eliza and Mato as dangerous fugitives who needed to be brought to heel. "There's something else," Deputy Morrison said, his young face troubled. "Samuel sent telegrams east before he rode out here, to some woman named Margaret Blackwood, telling her to come west and testify about your character." Eliza's blood turned to ice. Even in death, Samuel was reaching out to destroy her, and he'd chosen the one person guaranteed to finish what he'd started. "My sister," she said quietly. "She'll come. And when she does, she'll have stories that will make Samuel's accusations look like children's games." Mato was already moving toward their horses. "Then we'd better be gone before she arrives." But even as they prepared to flee deeper into the wilderness, Eliza found herself thinking about the young deputy who'd risked his life to uphold the law, about Hayes, who'd chosen justice over mob rule, about the possibility that somewhere in this harsh land, there might be people willing to listen to truth over convenient lies. "No," she said suddenly. "No more running." Mato paused in his packing. "Eliza, I'm tired of running, Mato. Tired of letting other people define who I am, tired of accepting guilt for crimes I didn't commit. If Margaret wants a confrontation, she can have one. But this time, I'll be ready for her." They didn't flee to the wilderness, as Mato had suggested. Instead, they rode to Ash Hollow, arriving in the dusty frontier town as the first snows of winter began to dust the wooden buildings and muddy streets. It was a hard place carved from unforgiving land by harder people. But it was also a place where the law still held meaning, however tenuously. Sheriff Thomas Garrett was a man in his 50s who'd worn a badge through 3 decades of frontier violence, and his weathered face showed every year of it. He listened to their story with the patience of someone who'd heard every variation of human folly imaginable, asking pointed questions and taking careful notes. Samuel's telegrams, he said when they finished, "They paint a pretty dark picture of you folks. Murder, theft, conspiracy with hostile, serious charges that'll bring federal attention if they're not answered proper." "And if they are answered?" Eliza asked. Garrett's smile was thin as winter sunlight. "Then we might just avoid having the cavalry ride in here looking for blood and glory. But it'll mean facing down this sister of yours when she arrives, and from what I hear, she's bringing friends." Margaret's arrival 3 days later was everything Eliza had expected and dreaded. The eastbound stage brought not just her sister, but a territorial prosecutor, 2 federal marshals, and enough legal documentation to hang a dozen people. They set up in the town's largest hotel like an occupying army, ready to dispense frontier justice with all the efficiency of an assembly line. When the sisters finally faced each other in the hotel's shabby lobby, Eliza was struck by how much Margaret had aged. The polished beauty that had once made her the belle of Bangor society was still there, but harder now, refined by years of careful cultivation into something that looked more like armor than attraction. "Hello, Eliza," Margaret said, her voice carrying the kind of cultured diction that marked her as foreign to this rough place. "You look rustic." Prison would do that to a person, Eliza replied calmly. Or in my case, surviving the wilderness you helped throw me into. The territorial prosecutor, a thin man named Caldwell with pale eyes and the bearing of someone who'd built his career on other people's misfortunes, stepped forward with official gravity. Miss Rowan, you're under arrest for theft, fraud, and conspiracy against the territorial government. The evidence against you is substantial. What evidence? Sheriff Garrett asked, inserting himself into the conversation with the authority of local jurisdiction. I'd like to see what you're basing these charges on. Caldwell produced a thick folder of documents, spreading them across the hotel's registration desk, like a dealer laying out cards. Letters, receipts, witness statements, all painting a picture of Eliza as a criminal mastermind who'd corrupted an innocent merchant and fled to her savage allies when discovery threatened. But as Sheriff Garrett examined the papers, his expression grew increasingly skeptical. Some of these documents, he said slowly, they reference events that happened after Samuel Bright's death. How'd you get witness statements about crimes that supposedly occurred 3 days ago when these papers are dated last week? Caldwell's confidence flickered for just a moment. Clerical errors. The important thing is the pattern of behavior they establish. The important thing, Garrett replied, is that half these documents appear to be forgeries, and the other half describe a woman who doesn't match the person standing in front of me. It was then that Mato played their ace card. He'd spent the 3 days since Margaret's arrival not hiding, but investigating using his knowledge of frontier communication networks to trace the source of Samuel's accusations. Prosecutor Caldwell, he said, stepping forward with a canvas bag in his hands. You might want to see what Samuel left behind before you proceed with this case. The bag contained Samuel's private papers, his real correspondence, his personal journal, his detailed records of previous marriages that had ended in mysterious disappearances. Most damning of all was his confession, written during a bout of drunken remorse, detailing his treatment of women who'd failed to live up to his impossible standards. As Caldwell read, his face went progressively paler. These weren't the writings of an innocent victim, but of a man consumed by shame and rage, willing to commit murder rather than face his own inadequacies. This changes nothing, Margaret said quickly, but there was desperation in her voice now. Samuel may have had his flaws, but that doesn't excuse what my sister did to him. And what exactly did she do? Sheriff Garrett asked. According to these papers, Samuel's own words, all she did was fail to be the fantasy woman he'd invented in his mind. She destroyed his reputation. She corrupted him with her Eastern ways, her educated opinions, her refusal to be the submissive wife he deserved. The words hung in the air like smoke, revealing more about Margaret's motivations than all her carefully constructed accusations. This wasn't about justice. It was about jealousy, about a sister who couldn't bear to see Eliza build a new life after Margaret had worked so hard to destroy the old one. Mrs. Blackwood, Caldwell said quietly, his prosecutorial instincts finally engaging with the right target. I think we need to discuss your role in constructing this case. Specifically, how you came to possess information about events that occurred thousands of miles from your home. Margaret's composure began to crack under official scrutiny. The careful story she'd constructed, innocent sister trying to see justice done, unraveled as Caldwell pressed for details about her sources, her methods, her motivations for traveling west to pursue charges against a sister she claimed to love. It was Deputy Morrison who delivered the final blow. The young lawman had spent his time investigating not the charges against Eliza, but the people bringing them. What he discovered was a trail of forged documents, bribed witnesses, and manufactured evidence that led directly back to Margaret's hotel room. Mrs. Blackwood, he said formally, you're under arrest for fraud conspiracy and filing false federal charges. The evidence against you is substantial and verifiable. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Margaret had come west to destroy her sister and found herself trapped by the same web of lies she'd spent years weaving. As the federal marshals placed her under arrest, she turned to Eliza with eyes full of tears and rage. "You've won," she said bitterly. "Are you satisfied?" Eliza looked at her sister, this woman who'd shared her childhood, who'd once been her closest friend, who'd ultimately become her greatest enemy. She felt no triumph, only a deep sadness for the waste of it all. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not satisfied. I'm just tired of carrying your hatred." The abandoned copper mine, 5 miles east of Ash Hollow, had been worked out 3 years earlier, leaving behind a maze of tunnels and shafts that honeyed the hillside like a deadly labyrinth. Local ranchers avoided the place. Too many stories of men who'd gone exploring and never emerged, of cave-ins that claimed livestock, and the occasional drifter who thought abandoned mines might hold overlooked treasure. It was the perfect place for an ambush. The message had come through Deputy Morrison, a request for a private meeting to discuss terms for Margaret's release. The sender claimed to be a federal judge with authority to resolve the case quietly away from the publicity that was beginning to attract unwanted attention from territorial newspapers. Sheriff Garrett had been suspicious from the start. No federal judge is going to conduct business in an abandoned mine. He'd told Eliza and Mato, "This smells like trouble of the worst kind." But the message had also contained information that only someone with inside knowledge could possess, details about Margaret's conspiracy, about Samuel's private papers, about the evidence that had cleared Eliza's name. Someone with access to official documents was extending an invitation that might be their only chance to end this nightmare permanently. "It's a trap," Mato said as they studied the crude map included with the message. "Has to be. Question is who's setting it and why?" Eliza stared at the paper, recognizing something familiar about the handwriting. Not the words themselves, but the careful way the letters were formed, the distinctive slant that reminded her of someone she'd met recently. "Prosecutor Caldwell," she said suddenly. "He's been too cooperative, too willing to accept evidence that discredits his own case." What if Margaret didn't come west alone? What if she brought more than just legal documentation? The realization hit them all simultaneously. Margaret had always been skilled at manipulating men, at convincing them that her cause was righteous and her enemies deserving of whatever fate she had planned. A territorial prosecutor, ambitious and hungry for cases that would advance his career, would be the perfect tool for the kind of revenge she specialized in. "So we don't go," Sheriff Garrett said. Simple as that. But Eliza was already shaking her head. "If we don't show, they'll come to us. And next time it won't be a private meeting, it'll be a federal warrant based on new evidence that we won't have a chance to contest." She was right, and they all knew it. Margaret had demonstrated a genius for long-term planning, for setting traps that closed slowly and inevitably around her targets. The only way to break free was to spring the trap on their own terms. They rode out at dawn, taking the long route through the hills to approach the mine from the north. The morning was crisp and clear, with that peculiar quality of light that made the Dakota landscape seem to stretch on forever. Under other circumstances, it would have been beautiful. The mine's main entrance yawned like a hungry mouth in the hillside, surrounded by the detritus of industrial ambition, rusted equipment, rotting timber piles of tailings that glittered with traces of copper ore. But what caught Mato's attention were the fresh horse tracks around the perimeter. Too many for a simple meeting between supposed allies. "At least a dozen riders," he said, studying the signs. "They've been here since before dawn, setting up positions." Sheriff Garrett checked his rifle and counted his ammunition. "How do you want to play this?" "We don't," Eliza said firmly. "This is my fight, my sister, my responsibility. I go in alone and face whatever she has planned." "Like hell," Mato replied. "We're past the point where individual nobility matters. Margaret wants all of us dead, you for defying her, me for protecting you. Garrett for upholding the law instead of frontier prejudice. This ends today, one way or another." They left their horses a quarter-mile away. and approached on foot using the broken terrain to mask their advance. The mine complex was larger than it had appeared from a distance, multiple entrances, processing buildings, even a small office structure that had somehow survived 3 years of weather and vandalism. The main tunnel was a black mouth that seemed to swallow light itself. Somewhere in those depths, Margaret was waiting with whatever allies she'd recruited to her cause. But Eliza had learned something during her months on the frontier. Darkness could be an ally as well as an enemy if you understood how to use it. "See there," Mato whispered, pointing to movement near the processing building. 3 men, maybe 4. Professional shooters by the way they're positioned. "And there's smoke coming from the office building," Garrett added. "Someone's made themselves comfortable, probably planning to wait us out." That was when Eliza spotted something that made her blood run cold. Tied to a post near the mine entrance was a familiar horse, Deputy Morrison's bay mare, the animal the young lawman had been riding when he'd left town the previous evening to investigate reports of rustling. "They have Morrison." She said the words tasting like ashes. "God help us, they've taken a lawman hostage." The stakes had just escalated beyond personal revenge. Taking a federal deputy was a capital offense that would bring the full weight of territorial justice down on everyone involved. Margaret had crossed a line that even frontier pragmatism couldn't overlook. "Changes things," Garrett said grimly. "We can't just walk away now." They had perhaps 30 minutes before the sun climbed high enough to eliminate the shadows that concealed their position. After that, they'd be exposed on open ground against an unknown number of enemies with superior position and firepower. It was Mato who suggested the desperate gambit that became their only chance. "The mine has multiple entrances," he said, pointing to dark openings scattered across the hillside. "If we can get inside the tunnel system, we might be able to approach from unexpected directions. Might also get lost in the dark and never find our way out," Garrett replied. "Better than getting shot down in broad daylight," Eliza said. "And I know something about those tunnels that might help." She'd spent her years as a teacher studying geology and mining techniques, fascinated by the industrial processes that were transforming the American landscape. Copper mines followed predictable patterns with main arteries connecting to smaller workings in a layout that resembled the root system of a massive tree. "The office building," she continued. "It's positioned directly above the main vein. If the miners followed standard practice, there should be a shaft connecting the surface operations to the tunnel system. Margaret chose this place because it's isolated, but she might not realize how connected it actually is." They split up, each taking a different entrance to the mine complex. Garrett would create a distraction at the main tunnel, drawing attention, while Mato and Eliza attempted to infiltrate through the smaller workings. It was a plan born of desperation, but it was better than charging blindly into crossfire. The tunnel Eliza chose was barely wide enough for a single person, carved from rock so hard it still showed pick marks after 3 years of abandonment. Her small oil lamp threw dancing shadows on the walls, creating the illusion of movement where none existed. Behind her, the entrance dwindled to a point of light that seemed impossibly distant. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old dynamite, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, water dripped with metronomic persistence. Every step took her deeper into the earth's embrace, away from the sun and wind and open spaces that had become her refuge. But she pressed on, following the tunnel's gradual descent toward what she hoped was the mine's central chamber. Along the way, she passed evidence of the miners' work, abandoned tools, broken timber supports, even a forgotten lunch pail that spoke of the day 3 years ago when the copper played out and the workers walked away from their dangerous labor. The tunnel branched and branched again, creating a maze that would have been impossible to navigate without her theoretical knowledge of mining layouts. But gradually the passages began to converge, and she could hear something that made her heart race, voices echoing from somewhere ahead. "Told you she'd come." My dear sister never could resist a dramatic confrontation. Margaret's voice, clear and confident, carrying the tone of someone who believed victory was inevitable. Eliza crept closer, using every shadow and depression in the rock to mask her approach. The tunnel opened into a natural chamber that had been enlarged by human effort, its walls lined with abandoned equipment and timber supports. Oil lamps provided flickering illumination, revealing a scene that was part courtroom and part execution ground. Margaret stood in the center of the chamber, like a queen holding court dressed in traveling clothes that somehow managed to look elegant even in this rough setting. Around her were half a dozen men, not the rough frontier types Eliza had expected, but professionals with the cold eyes and careful movements of hired killers. At their center, bound to a wooden chair with rope and clearly beaten, sat Deputy Morrison. His young face was swollen and bloody, but his eyes still held defiance. "You see, Deputy Sakharost," Margaret was saying, her voice carrying the cultured tones that had once charmed Boston society. "This is what happens when good men try to protect evil women. My sister has corrupted everyone she's touched, turned them against natural order and Christian values." Prosecutor Caldwell stood beside her, but his earlier confidence had been replaced by obvious unease. "Mrs. Blackwood, this has gone far beyond what we discussed. Taking a federal officer hostage is unnecessary." Margaret cut him off sharply. "You've seen the evidence of what she's capable of. Did you think someone like that would surrender quietly to justice?" From her hiding place in the tunnel mouth, Eliza could see the entire scene with crystalline clarity. This wasn't about justice. It was about Margaret's need to control the narrative, to be the one who delivered final judgment on the sister who dared to escape her web of lies. But it was what she saw next that made her blood turn to ice. In the far corner of the chamber, barely visible in the lamp's flickering light, lay two more bodies. She recognized one as a territorial ranger who'd gone missing the previous week. The other was a stranger, but his position and the pool of blood beneath him told a clear story. Margaret wasn't just planning to execute her enemies, she was already doing it. The beauty of this place. Margaret continued pacing around Morrison's chair like a lawyer addressing a jury, is that no one will ever find the bodies. 3 years from now, when these tunnels finally collapse, any evidence will be buried so deep that even God himself couldn't dig it up. That was when the first gunshot echoed through the chamber, Sheriff Garrett's signal from the main entrance. The sound galvanized Margaret's men into action, 3 of them heading toward the tunnel mouth, while the others maintained positions around their prisoners. In the confusion, Eliza saw her chance. She slipped into the chamber, while attention was focused elsewhere, using the abandoned equipment as cover. Her goal was Morrison's position. If she could free the deputy, they might have a fighting chance. But Margaret had always possessed an uncanny ability to sense her sister's presence. As Eliza crept toward the bound lawman, Margaret's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. "Hello, Eliza. I was wondering when you'd join our little gathering." The words froze Eliza in place, her heart hammering against her ribs. Around the chamber, gun barrels swung toward her position, and she found herself looking down the dark eyes of death itself. "I have to admit," Margaret continued, her voice bright with satisfaction, "I'm impressed. It took real courage to walk into this trap knowing what awaited you. But then, you always were braver than you were smart." Eliza stepped into the light, her hands raised, but her chin lifted in defiance. "Let Morrison go, Margaret. This is between us. It always has been." "Oh, but it's not just between us anymore, is it?" Margaret's smile was cold as winter starlight. "You've corrupted so many people, turned them against their own kind. The deputy here, that savage you're living with, even that old sheriff who should know better. They all need to answer for the part they've played in your rebellion." Rebellion. Eliza couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice. "Against what? Against your version of how the world should work? Against nature itself?" Margaret's composure cracked for the first time, revealing the fury that had driven her across a continent. "You were supposed to be ruined, Eliza destroyed, forgotten. Instead, you've built something new, something that makes a mockery of everything I've worked to preserve." The truth hung between them like smoke from the oil lamps. This had never been about Samuel Bright or frontier justice or any of the elaborate justifications Margaret had constructed. It was about a sister who couldn't bear to see Eliza succeed where she had failed. "You want to know what I've preserved." Margaret continued, her voice rising to near hysteria. "A marriage to a man who beats me, a social position built on lies, a life so empty that destroying you has become my only purpose. But at least I know my place in the natural order." Movement in the shadows caught Eliza's attention, Mato emerging from a side tunnel with his rifle raised. But Margaret's men had seen him too, and crossfire erupted in the confined space with deafening intensity. The battle that followed was chaos incarnate. Gunshots echoed off stone walls with multiplied fury, creating a din that made coordination impossible. Oil lamps shattered, plunging sections of the chamber into darkness, where muzzle flashes became the only source of illumination. Eliza threw herself toward Morrison's chair as bullets whined overhead, her fingers working frantically at the ropes that bound him. The deputy was conscious, but barely, his face a mask of pain and determination. "How many?" she asked as the last rope parted. "6 when they brought me down." Morrison gasped. "Maybe more above ground." A bullet splintered the wood beside Eliza's head, sending splinters flying like angry wasps. She could see Mato pressed against the far wall, returning fire with methodical precision. But they were outnumbered and outgunned in a space that offered little cover. That was when she noticed something that sent hope racing through her veins. The wooden support timbers overhead were old, weathered, and showing signs of stress from 3 years of abandonment. The chamber was on the verge of collapse, held up more by habit than engineering. "The Mato," she called over the gunfire. "The ceiling." He understood immediately, shifting his aim from Margaret's men to the support structure above their heads. His first shot splintered a key beam, sending dust and small stones cascading into the chamber. His second shot brought down a section of timber that crashed into the abandoned equipment with thunderous force. Margaret's men began to panic as the chamber filled with dust and the groaning of overstressed wood. But Margaret herself seemed oblivious to the danger, her attention focused entirely on reaching Eliza before the tunnels claimed them all. "You won't escape me again," she screamed, drawing a small pistol from her traveling bag. "I won't let you build your perfect life on the ashes of mine." The shot went wide as another timber crashed down. But Margaret was already moving, her face twisted with years of accumulated rage and jealousy. Behind her, Prosecutor Caldwell was shouting for retreat, but his words were lost in the growing roar of collapsing stone. Eliza grabbed Morrison under the arms and began dragging him toward the tunnel she'd entered through. But the deputy was dead weight in her arms, his injuries making movements slow and painful. Around them, the chamber was disintegrating with gathering speed, each falling timber bringing down more of the ceiling in an accelerating cascade of destruction. Mato appeared beside her, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, but his movement still sure and strong. Together, they hauled Morrison toward the tunnel mouth as Margaret's remaining men fled for the main entrance. But Margaret herself kept coming, her pistol raised despite the chaos around her. 23 years, she screamed over the destruction. 23 years I've planned your destruction. I won't be cheated now. The shot that followed wasn't from Margaret's pistol, but from Sheriff Garrett's rifle as the old lawman emerged from the main tunnel. The bullet took Margaret in the shoulder, spinning her around, but not stopping her advance. "It's over, Margaret," Eliza called out, still struggling with Morrison's weight. "The tunnels are coming down. We all die if we don't get out now." But Margaret was beyond reason, beyond fear, beyond anything, except the consuming need to see her sister destroyed. She raised the pistol again, her finger tightening on the trigger, her face a mask of vindictive triumph. The ceiling chose that moment to deliver its own judgment. a massive timber weakened by Mato's shots, and the chamber's instability broke free with a sound like thunder and crashed down directly onto Margaret's position. The silence that followed was more complete than death itself. When the dust settled, Eliza found herself in the tunnel mouth, with Morrison slumped against her shoulder and Mato's strong arms around them both. Behind them, the chamber had become a tomb of stone and timber, sealing Margaret's hatred beneath tons of Dakota earth. They emerged into sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after the mine's darkness, their clothes torn and dust-covered, but alive. Sheriff Garrett was waiting with the horses, his weathered face grim with the knowledge of what they'd all witnessed. The others, Eliza asked, scattered when the shooting started. Garrett replied, Caldwell's probably halfway back to the territorial capital by now, and the hired guns won't stick around without someone to pay them. As they rode back toward Ash Hollow, Morrison, clinging to his saddle with gritty determination, Eliza found herself thinking not about Margaret's death, but about her life. The choices that had led a once beautiful woman to die alone in a collapsing mine, consumed by hatred for a sister who'd only wanted to be free. She could have had everything, she said quietly. Beauty, intelligence, social position. But it wasn't enough unless everyone else had nothing. Mato's hand found hers across the space between their horses. Some people, he said, are born to build. Others are born to tear down. The tragedy is when they're born into the same family. The inquiry that followed was brief and conclusive. Margaret's conspiracy unraveled quickly once Prosecutor Caldwell began cooperating with territorial authorities, revealing the scope of her manipulation and the bribes she'd used to construct her case. The hired killers were rounded up within a week, their testimony confirming that Margaret had planned not just Eliza's death, but a campaign of violence that would have claimed dozens of lives. Deputy Morrison recovered from his injuries with the resilience of youth, though he carried scars that would remind him for the rest of his life about the price of frontier justice. Sheriff Garrett received a commendation from the territorial governor for his handling of the case, though he privately admitted that luck had played as large a role as skill in bringing it to a conclusion. For Eliza and Mato, vindication brought not celebration, but a strange sense of emptiness. They'd spent so long running from Margaret's hatred that freedom felt almost foreign, like a language they'd forgotten how to speak. What now? Mato asked as they stood outside the sheriff's office, watching Ash Hollow's daily life continue around them with the casual indifference of people who'd never doubted their right to exist. Eliza looked down the dusty street toward the horizon, where the prairie stretched endlessly under a sky so vast it seemed to contain all possibilities. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of civilization's judgments and prejudices, lay the life they'd begun to build before Margaret's final conspiracy had called them back to face the past. Now, she said, we go home, and we finish what we started. The valley they returned to had been touched by early winter, the stream running clear and cold between banks dusted with the first snow. Their cabin stood exactly as they'd left it, small but solid, a testament to the possibility that two broken people could build something whole from the fragments of their separate lives. But they didn't simply resume their old routine. The confrontation with Margaret had changed them both, stripping away the last vestiges of the people they'd been before. Exile and betrayal had marked them as outcasts. They were free now, not just from legal charges, but from the weight of shame that had burdened them both. Eliza expanded her school drawing students, not just from the immediate area, but from across the territory. Word spread about the teacher who'd survived a conspiracy that reached from Maine to Dakota, who'd built bridges between white and native communities, who proved that education could overcome prejudice if given the chance. Mato found new purpose as well, his skills as a tracker and negotiator making him valuable to territorial officials who were finally beginning to understand that peace required justice, not just superior firepower. He wore his silver badge with quiet pride, knowing that he'd earned the right to serve the law that had once failed him so completely. They married that spring in a ceremony that blended Comanche tradition with frontier pragmatism. The territorial government might not recognize their union, but the people who mattered, their students, their neighbors, the fellow outcasts who'd found sanctuary in their valley, understood that some bonds transcended legal documentation. Years passed. The frontier began its slow transformation into something approaching civilization, though it retained the hard edges that had shaped their generation. Eliza's school grew into an institution that drew visitors from across the region, proof that education could flourish even in the harshest environments. When statehood came to Dakota, bringing with it new laws and new opportunities, Eliza was invited to address the Constitutional Convention about education policy. Standing before the assembled delegates, many of whom had once viewed her as a dangerous radical, she spoke not about the past, but about the future. About children who would inherit a world where prejudice mattered less than potential, where origin mattered less than ambition. We stand at a crossroads. She told them, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd paid the full price for the freedom to speak. We can build a state that rewards merit regardless of race or gender or circumstance of birth. Or we can build another version of the same old prejudices that have poisoned our nation since its founding. The choice is ours, and history will judge us by the choice we make. The speech became legend, quoted in newspapers across the emerging state and beyond. But for Eliza, the words mattered less than the faces in the audience, former enemies who'd learned to listen, former allies who'd found the courage to stand with justice instead of convention. That evening, as she and Mato sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the Dakota sky in shades of gold and crimson, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment of peace. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "what would have happened if Samuel hadn't abandoned me in that blizzard?" Mato considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "I think," he said finally, "that we would have found each other anyway. Some meetings are inevitable, written in the stars or the wind or whatever force shapes the world's design. You really believe that?" "I believe that courage finds courage, that justice finds justice, that people who refuse to accept the world's worst impulses will always discover they're not alone." As if summoned by his words, a wolf howled somewhere in the distance. Not the mournful cry of a predator seeking prey, but the triumphant song of a creature that had survived winter and found spring waiting on the far side of endurance. Eliza smiled and took her husband's hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of honest work and the scars that marked him as a survivor. Around them, their valley lay peaceful under the vast Dakota sky shelter for anyone brave enough to believe that home could be built from hope and stubborn will. The frontier had tested them. Betrayal had nearly broken them. But in the end, they'd proven something more valuable than innocence. They'd proven that the human spirit, given time and freedom and purpose, could transform even the cruelest winter into the promise of endless spring. In the distance, more wolves joined the first, their voices blending into a chorus that seemed to celebrate not just survival, but triumph, the victory of creation over destruction of love, over hatred of hope, over the darkest impulses of the human heart. It was, Eliza thought, as she closed her eyes and listened to the wild music of her adopted homeland, the most beautiful sound in the world, and she planned to keep earning the right to hear it for many years to come.